This memorial is a reminder to Irish Americans of a war whose victims we have not recognized. And that's the war of industrial labor of the 19th century. And the Irish were the mules of that effort.
It's an enlisted men's prison. You have these men who I always feel get a very raw deal when it comes to American Civil War history. They are regarded as men somehow morally inferior, that they were motivated by money and just didn't have the same moral standing. There's a perception that they didn't have the same reasons for enlisting.
I'm John Lee, and that first voice you heard, Professor James Walsh, project historian for the Leadville Irish Miners Memorial.
And the second voice you heard was Dr. Damian Shiels speaking about Irish prisoners in the notorious Andersonville Prison during the American Civil War. And my name is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to Irish Stew.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com. Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Irish Stew. I'm John Lee, and Martin's going to do the introductions here, and it's going to be twice as challenging as usual.
Hey, John, great to be back on the podcast, and welcome to all our listeners to Irish Stew, the conversation for the global Irish nation. And this is a different type of podcast. For the first time, we have two guests on the podcast. And for the first time, we actually have a repeating guest. So I'm delighted to bring Damian Shiels back on the podcast. For those of you that might have listened to an earlier episode, and I hope you have, we had him on season 1, episode number 7. So you'll see that in our back catalog. Welcome back, Damian. And congratulations. I saw a picture of you wearing your doctoral duds, I suppose we can call it.
Yeah, thanks, Martin and John. It's good to be back.
That's Dr. Shiels to you, Martin.
That's it.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm still going to go with the old informal Damian.
That's the best way to be going. Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me back on.
And we're also joined by Jim Walsh, who also has a doctorate in history. Jim is originally from Pennsylvania. He's a professor of political science at the University of Colorado in Denver. And he specializes, if I'm correct, in labor and working class and immigration history and politics. He's interested in social movements and community organizing. So welcome, Jim.
It's great to be here.
Welcome, Jim.
Now, there's a reason why we have these two gentlemen on here at the same time. Originally, I toyed with the idea of calling the podcast the graveyard episode. Then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that graveyard actually wasn't the right type, because actually these two gentlemen are both working on two different projects about cemeteries. Now, my question is to my co-host, what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery?
I think a graveyard is a little bit more informal here, Martin. It sounds a little more vernacular, and that's about as good as I can come up with.
I love putting you on the spot.
That's what we do here. That's what we do.
So apparently, somewhere in my beady memories, it kicked off a thought that there was an actual distinction. So I fired up the Google machine and realized that a graveyard is usually attached to a church. And is religious specific, whereas a cemetery is not. And generally, cemeteries are a lot larger than graveyards. So, piece of trivia for the day. Now, by way of introduction, let's do it this way. Jim, since you're new to the podcast, why don't you tell us a little bit about the journey from Pennsylvania over to Denver, Colorado?
How I ended up out here.
Exactly.
Yeah, I grew up near Pittsburgh. I'm from a big Irish family as steel workers, and I joined a wrestling team when I was in middle school, and it got me a state championship and a scholarship at Duke University, and headed out there and never looked back. I still go back to Pennsylvania a lot, but I wanted to get out west after that, and made my way to Boulder, Colorado in 1990 to study poetry at a Buddhist university called Naropa. And then I thought I'd be here for summer, and here I am 30 years later.
So is this kind of an ambition to be a ski bum out in Colorado, or was there something else driving that beyond poetry?
I'm not much of a skier, but I do a lot of cycling and hiking. And when I got out here and saw the scenery, there was no going back.
Now we're going to flash forward a little bit into that path, I believe, and I know you're working on the, I'm not sure what the officially correct term for it is, the Leadville Irish Miners Memorial, I believe. But apparently this has been your life's work. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and a little bit, maybe set the scene about Leadville for, our listeners that are not familiar with this town?
Yeah, I thought this would be just a dissertation that I would leave behind me 15 years ago, but it's become my life's work and it's never left me. So Leadville is today a small town of 3,000 people in the center of Colorado in the Rockies. It's the highest elevation of any incorporated town in North America, 10,200 feet. The site of one of the greatest silver rushes in North American history that started in around 1878 and began to decline in the 1890s. It was about a 15-year rush. And because of that silver rush, the largest Irish community in the Colorado history, and I think in the Rocky Mountain region in the early 1880s was in Leadville. And this was a little bit before Butte began to boom out west. And so Leadville was the place at that time. In the back of Evergreen Cemetery in Leadville, in the Catholic pauper section, we see a visual representation of just how horrific life was for these Irish immigrants and their families.
Jim, maybe you could give, we're audio, but maybe you could paint a little picture of what that pauper's graveyard looked like. It's an eerie place.
It is. It's in the back of the cemetery. It's in a pine forest. It was cleared at the time of the burials, but the trees have since grown up around it, which actually also makes it quite a beautiful space and very serene. But what you see when you walk past the marked graves and get to the pauper section are acres of sunken, unmarked graves. They just put people in pine boxes and dug a hole, put them in the ground in rows. And they're in pretty straight rows. It's not like they just did it hodgepodge, but the pine boxes deteriorated, the graves sunk, and the crude wooden markers that they etched their names on have long since rotted and fallen over. So all you see today are, as far as you can see, are just rows of sunken, unmarked graves. It's very eerie. And when I found out that maybe as many as 80% of them are Irish, it sort of galvanized me to begin to mobilize support for a memorial, to reach out to the Irish government, Irish community, Irish American communities, and make this a space not just of Leadville history, Colorado history, but really the history of the entire Rocky Mountain West, which is one of the least talked about and written about aspects of Irish American history is the West. And so this memorial will, I think, rewrite the history of this area, of this region, Irish immigrants out here. And it also is the average age of the people that we're memorializing is 23. And there's about 1,400 of them. Half of them are children. So half of them are 12 and younger. And there are entire sections that were only babies and infants and stillborn. So about a third of the entire section consists entirely of babies and stillborn. So it's you can't help when you know those numbers and you walk through the graves, you can't help but feel impacted by that and realize how difficult life was for Irish. I mean, the Irish were the bottom of the social ladder in Leadville. Life was hard for everybody in Leadville, but for the Irish, it was particularly hard because economically they were at the bottom of the social ladder. So healthcare, working conditions, there were several epidemics. And we feel like this isn't just a Leadville story, it's a story of the entire Rocky Mountain mining region. The Irish were in just about every mining community, and transient, young, desperate people, many of them without, education or resources to draw from. And they ended up in these mining communities. So this is a memorial that will bring a history lesson, and provoke a larger conversation about Irish American history.
I saw a little interview that Ambassador Dan Mulhall did out there with you a year or two ago, and he made a comment about it's the memorial in this effort is a way to cast our minds back to darker days, which is usually not the immigrant story that's told.
Yeah, there's so much to that, to what you just said, John, related to the memorial. I grew up in a large Irish Catholic family, but the only thing we were ever told is that we were Irish, and it stopped there. So it wasn't until I was in graduate school I began to learn more. I began to learn two of my great grandparents died in train accidents, and a third almost died because he was thrown off the train as a brakeman. I learned about the horrors of industrial labor, 19th century industrial labor. So this memorial is a reminder to Irish Americans of a war whose victims we have not recognized. And that's the war of industrial labor of the 19th century. And the Irish were the mules of that effort in so many ways. And I think my family's not an exception. I think the majority of Irish Americans are not taught that the message is always a forward message. Get educated, get respect, move forward. And so this is a memorial, I like to say, where Irish Americans can pause and turn around and finally look backward and recognize the giants whose shoulders we stand on. So that's what we're doing out here in Colorado, and we're thrilled that it's gained a lot of attention nationwide. That Irish America and Ireland are really looking toward Leadville today and seeing what we can all learn together.
Speaking of industrial war, I'm going to switch over to our other guest, Damian Shiels, because Damian's project is part of his extensive work on the Irish involvement in the American Civil War. Specifically, I believe you're calling it the Andersonville Irish Project. Is that correct, Damian?
Yeah, that's right, Martin. It's actually the exact same class of people that Jim was talking about. So, like as we discussed in the last podcast, the huge numbers, and these are all federal United States troops we're talking about here. The vast bulk of these Irish guys are poor urban working class men and their families who are enlisting in the Union military. So that's one of the real attractions to researching them, because the American Civil War, and it's something that social historians I think need to look at a bit more actually than they do currently. It created such a vast amount of information and material surrounding it that it's actually got an incredible amount to teach us about the lives of 19th century Irish people beyond the conflict itself. But that was one of the things that drew me to the Andersonville Project. Anytime I've ever been in the States, I think we discussed it on the last podcast, the main source I work on are widows' pension files from the Civil War. So the pension claims by women and dependent parents of men who died in the conflict because of the amount of information they leave behind. So anytime I've ever been in the US, I've always made it a kind of a mission to go to any national cemetery that was nearby and just walk the gravestones and take photographs of any Irish sounding name that was there, and then do subsequent research. But I mean, it's always been an aim of mine, because Andersonville is the largest area where Irish Americans who died in the conflict will be buried, almost without a doubt. There's in the region of 13,000 men perished there in the bones of about a year down in Georgia when they were kept there. And very
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
Because maybe some of our listeners aren't familiar with exactly what Andersonville is. So if you could kind of just, set that piece up, and then, I really want to drill into that. Yeah,
no problem. So I suppose, and I won't go into the ins and outs so much of why it happened, but by the summer of 1863, there had been a system of prisoner exchanges that had been going on between the US and the Confederacy during the course of the war, and that had broken down. So from, if you like to think in your mind's eye, from about the period of the Battle of Gettysburg onwards, you had a good chance, if you were captured, that you were not going to get exchanged on either side. And it created a serious problem for both sides in the course of the war. But for the Confederacy, they found that huge numbers of men were being incarcerated in and around Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And this was a cause of major concern. So in February of 1864, they decided to find a new prison to move guys on. And they came across this place in rural Georgia, where they built a stockade, originally 16 and a half acres in size, eventually grew to 26 and a half acres, where they began to send US troops, and they began to increase and increase. It opened in February of 1864, so a very short-lived prison. And as the summer wore on, there was no cover of any sort within this very simple stockade, and increasing numbers of prisoners as the campaign of 1864, the Overland Campaign, and the campaign towards Atlanta caught steam in May of 1864. There were significantly increased numbers of prisoners being put in there. So by August of 1864, there were 33,000 US troops being held there. All in all, around 45,000 US soldiers went through it. And it decreased in size considerably after the fall of Atlanta towards the end of 1864, but it was still in operation by the end of the conflict. So of the 45,000 men who went in there, in and around 13,000 of them didn't come out again. And there was it's fortunate, a lot of men in the Civil War are unidentified, but a man called Dorrance Atwater, who had been volunteering, he'd been working in the hospital at Andersonville, had been recording the names of the men against the numbers that they were put in the cemetery. So himself and Clara Barton, who's very famous nurse from the Civil War, went afterwards to Andersonville, to the National Cemetery, and put people's names on the headstones. So as a result of that, very, very few of the headstones in that National Cemetery are proportionately of unknown soldiers. An awful lot of these guys are named. So you have this mass of men in there. So you've guys who it's an interesting mix of this Irish working class enlisted men. It's an enlisted men's prison, I should add. But it's you have these men who were veteran volunteers who had enlisted in 1861, but you have a lot of these men who enlist in 1863, 1864, who I always feel get a very raw deal when it comes to American Civil War history. They are regarded as men who just enlisted because they're regarded in many respects as somehow morally inferior, that they were motivated by money and just didn't have the same, I suppose, moral standing. There's a perception that they didn't have the same reasons for enlisting. And I've had a problem with that when you begin to dig into ordinary war. That's a false impression that people have, and they often have very real reasons for enlisting that are any bit as honourable as those who enlisted in 1861 and 1862. But because it's this area that has then because of the number of guys who died there, because of the scale of Irish service, which we spoke about, in and around 250,000 Irish Americans serve in US forces. Again, it's been massively underrepresented in most of the historiography, but about 250,000 Irish Americans fight for the US. It's an ideal location to do a number of things, to kind of remember them, but to try and tie people back to the United States, to create a database that allows you to have a group of men to examine, to explore the experience of their families, to explore how their Irish American families in the decades, and now as we push into centuries since, have memorialized those people in the cemeteries. And so it does an awful lot of things there. So that's kind of the bones of where we're coming from. And I suppose I should acknowledge at the outset, the support that we've been getting is fantastic from the Consulate General of Ireland in Atlanta, and the Department of Foreign Affairs, and Professor Nicholas Allen in the University of Georgia, all who are have been giving great support to it. But we hope, as well as the database and everything we have, that there will be some form of memorial that goes up to them in and around Andersonville as well.
Actually, I have a question for both of you. From Damian's comments, it sort of mirrors on a different scale, perhaps, what Jim is wrestling with. But it's from things I've seen, it sounds like you both have the challenge of figuring out who is Irish that you're talking about. Because I saw, Jim, a presentation you gave and a graphic you showed. And Damian, we had this conversation in the past, well, there were the people from Ireland. There were the people who were the next generation who grew up in Irish communities in Pittsburgh and in mining areas around the East Coast. There were the Canadians who were essentially Irish. There were people from England who grew up in Irish communities within England and made it over. Is that a challenge for you, or is that just kind of expand the tapestry of what we're talking about here? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. Like you said, I found in Leadville there were Irish communities who had first gone to England to mine and then to North America. Many of them in Canadian mine before they went to Leadville, and many of them were born in Canada. So it gets a little bit difficult to identify. The cemetery records are particularly difficult because all they list is name and age. So we've had to cross list a lot of those against the church records to confirm their ethnicity, and we've managed to find a large enough pool to verify that it's overwhelmingly an Irish cemetery in the pauper part of it. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but we feel like we're on pretty solid ground.
Yeah, it is a big challenge, certainly, in terms of how I classify people generally, and I think we might have touched on this the last time. For the work I was doing in the American Civil War, I if you like, used the definition of Irish American that included the native born, so people born in the island of Ireland, but then anybody born to Irish parents in Britain, Canada, or the United States, were the criteria I use for the general. And I think there's enough evidence historically to show that the ethnic communities are really very cohesive. Like if you were born to Irish parents in the US, it was more than likely going to be the case that you were going to marry into the Irish community, for example. So there's a kind of a dual identity thing. It is very challenging, I must say, more challenging than when I was studying the broader military. But when you're dealing specifically with a cemetery, it's very challenging to find those non-Irish born men. So the vast majority of the guys we have on our database now, it's in excess of 500 men in Andersonville, and it's kind of only really getting started. But the vast bulk of them were born in Ireland because, the things that you can check, like their military records or the pension files that might say where they're born, are just going to list Irishness. But if they're born elsewhere, indicating that they are ethnically Irish with some surety is more challenging. Surnames are a very good likelihood of that, but we do have some. So, for example, we have a set of two brothers who both die in Andersonville who were born into an Irish community in England, but their parents married in Mayo. And so we have that record of that marriage, and then you can follow them. Sometimes the correspondence that they have indicates that they're there. one of the other big challenges, one of the interesting things coming out of it as well, is the not classically Irish. Recent guy I came across now is a guy with the name of George Bell, which isn't something that you would jump on and say, well, that guy is definitely Irish. But he marries a Palatine in Limerick, and he's from Dublin. And, you know, you find that type of guy because you're looking at everybody in the cemetery. So we're getting Ulster Presbyterians and everybody are included in this. So it's an interesting project from that regard. But they are much more challenging to find the people who are part of the Irish community who weren't born in Ireland when you're looking at a cemetery.
I'll add another challenge we faced was not necessarily identifying people by their ethnicity, but by their class. It's an Irish memorial. It always will be an Irish memorial that we're constructing, but it didn't quite feel right to leave the names of the people who were non-Irish off the memorial. And so we talked about that and decided to include them. They work together, they die together, they struggle together. Why shouldn't they be memorialized together? So it's raised a lot of important conversations for us about these issues of inclusivity.
So, Damian, just going back to you, am I correct in understanding that you're encouraging people also to kind of provide you background information? In other words, you're not just looking at archival records, but you're kind of relying to kind of crowdsource some of this stuff. I'm also curious if Jim is kind of doing anything along those lines.
Yeah, so we're looking for anyone who has information. We're interested in anyone who was in Andersonville generally, because it impacted the lives of a lot of people who got out of there. A lot of guys who died actually outside, they died as a result of Andersonville, but not necessarily in Andersonville itself. But the focus is primarily Andersonville National Cemetery, and we have that call out. We've got some very good contributions. We have a few people who are actually going looking for them as well for us, as people are always great to do in terms of volunteering their time to do that. But yeah, the bulk of them are still us trying to trawl through all the records, but we've got some really interesting ones. And as I say, that kind of element, you know, people have been researching these guys maybe across 2 or 3 generations. Really interesting. Though that kind of memory story is very interesting. And even the memory story where people might have only discovered this ancestor in recent years with the kind of onset of internet research and things. What it means to them, you know, people have been sending us family visits where they've kind of gone on pilgrimage to Andersonville and had their photograph taken beside these guys' grave. It's really highly emotive stuff. But yeah, and if any of your listeners know, we do have, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it, like people can check the database as it currently is, but we're always keen. There's an email on the site to have new contributions, and anyone who wants to go out there and have a dig for some of these guys and put them forward for addition to the database, we'd be delighted to have it.
Not dig the grave.
No, not dig the grave. No.
Dig the data.
Yeah, dig the data. Yeah, an important distinction.
So, Jim, do you have any kind of family members, existing family members that can trace back to the graveyard? Has that been any of your experience? Or how does that work?
Yeah, I've received dozens of emails over the past year from families who want to know if I've come across this name or that name, my great grandfather. And I try to give each of them a little bit of time to look through the records, and more times than not, I do find not only their ancestors, but I often find infants, stillborn babies that are buried alongside them that they didn't know about. And so, so I've started, I call it the descendants list. I just have a list of names and emails of the people I've been in touch with. It's now over 30 people, and it's growing. So I feel like there's a commonality here, which is, remembering and recognizing people who were very desperate and poor, and often it's the working class, it's forgotten class, and so the work I feel like both of us are doing here is to counter that a little bit, to give honor and dignity to these folks.
Yeah, let me just jump in there, because I'm going to ask a more fundamental question to both of you. I like going to graveyards and cemeteries. I consider myself to be a little bit unusual. I'm guessing I'm talking to some kindred spirits on a level. For a lot of people, they might look at this and say, okay, well, these people died 100, 150 years ago, right? Why do we care at this point? Why does global Irish nation, being that, Irish people from Ireland or Irish people in America or anywhere else in the world, care about this story? How do you make that case? So I'll ask you to take a crack at that, Jim.
Yeah, for me, that's easy. We're honoring and paying tribute to 19th century immigrant workers with this memorial. We cannot do that work and ignore the struggles of 21st century immigrant workers. And so for me, and I think for those of us involved, we see this as a bridge between eras, a bridge between cultures. And we're having a big ceremony next Sunday up at the memorial, expecting a big crowd with speeches, and we've invited some elders from the present day immigrant community in Leadville. Leadville today is 40% immigrant, mostly from Chihuahua. And some elders from that community are going to speak, because it's so important to us that this memorial is a space not just for Irish people, but for people who understand and feel the human experience of migration and of displacement and of family separation. So we want this to be a welcoming space, an inclusive space, and a space where those bridges will strengthen.
And Damian, how do you make the case in Andersonville, the Irish?
It's kind of multifaceted. I started the whole project because of a feeling that from a perspective of Ireland itself, where I felt that these guys were largely forgotten in an Irish context, and particularly forgotten in respect of what they did in order to try and support their families, both in the US and their Irish communities there and in Ireland. There's plenty of people in Ireland today who probably wouldn't be here only for the money that was sent back by some of the guys who are buried in places like Andersonville. And I think there's a real need for people to understand that and to get that window into immigration. I think it's impossible, as Jim was alluding to there, it is impossible to work on the immigrant experience, particularly working class immigrant experience in the 19th century, and not see parallels everywhere. And you even see the replacement communities. I often think of it in places like New York. If you go, I went into Old St. Patrick's Cathedral to see one of the most famous, if you like, immigrant Irish churches in New York, and there was a Spanish service underway there. The area, the 5 Points, has been like a replacement immigrant community consistently, and is now effectively Chinatown there now. So you see this kind of the same sort of elements. And it's about understanding. And so there is this kind of multi-layered, and as I said, there's a kind of, I have an issue with the kind of throwing all of these guys in the Civil War into kind of very defined boxes, as I say. And so getting a bit more complexity into the understanding of Irish American immigrants as well is a big opportunity, I think, with doing this sort of thing. Looking at the individuals and their particular perspectives is really important, I think, and it gives you a bit of an insight into everybody's heritage, really, doesn't it? Into the global heritage of immigration and migration that we have, and then that struggle that an awful lot of people came from in the working class and why they were making the decisions they were, and a bit more understanding. So, yeah.
David, I'd like to pick that up with both of you, and I was thinking of something that Dan Mulhall said up in Leadville at that ceremony, how Jim's project is going to help foster a better understanding of the true nature of the global Irish. Let's give some people a little bit of an insight to that these chapters of the global Irish. Jim, you've got people coming from basically sea level in temperate Ireland to the highest elevation incorporated city in America, with winters that the people at that time must have found beyond belief. What was a day in the life at that point of their short-lived lives?
Well, I read somewhere that those who survived the famine and made it to North America only lived an average of 7 years. And I feel like the adults that are buried up there they would have experienced the famine during their childhood, and so it's in many ways a representation of that. The average life was $3 a day for the miners, 10-hour work days. There's stories of sweating so much their coats were drenched with sweat in the mine, and then emerging in winter in 5 below, and by the time they got home, their coat was frozen solid with ice. None of the modern amenities we think about today in terms of plumbing or electricity, and so I don't think any of them could have been prepared for what they were facing when they made the decision to go out there. I'll say too that another aspect of this memorial that we're hoping it inspires is a respect for the labor movement in this country, and of course the Irish were at the forefront of that struggle. In Leadville they organized unions, fought for recognition for those unions, went on strike twice, massive strikes, shut down the mines for months. Both times the governor of the state declared martial law and sent National Guard to crush the strikes. But what they were fighting for was basic $4 a day, better safety conditions, and the right to form a union. Nothing terribly radical about that. So I think we're also hoping that this larger story speaks to that too.
How about you, Damian? What did the prisoner encounter entering?
Yeah, well, again, there's a certain poignancy to some of these guys. Well, nearly all their families had lived through the famine, and a number of them had lived through the famine. There's kind of a growing body of evidence just on that point and I'm interested to see when we finish it. I'm coming across an awful lot of older guys, like guys in their mid-40s, dying in Andersonville, more than you would come across in kind of the standard war. So it seems to me like, they can't take it as well as younger fellas. But most of those guys were adults, even at the time of the famine. And you come across, I have widows whose family, they've lost husbands in the famine in Ireland, and then their sons are dying of the same diseases same famine-related, starvation-related diseases in Andersonville. Mm-hmm. But a kind of a day in the life was pretty horrific. And that's one of the things we're trying to unpick. So we want to try and find out things like how, because the Irish were subjected to significant discrimination even among the Union military. So one of the things we're trying to unpick is how they interrelated with each other and with men of their unit, for example. So a good example of that is we're finding evidence, of a group of guys who are all Pennsylvania Donegal men, who are in different units, who seem to be sorting each other out. They're taking the wills of other men, Donegal, Pennsylvania men, and keeping it on their body and passing it on so that they can bring stuff back, so that kind of localism in Ireland and so it's either these are Donegal men, these are Pennsylvania men, and they're using those kind of bonds to stick together. But a day in Andersonville was pretty horrific. Anyone who wants to kind of see what it was like, there's a series of phenomenal photographs that you can, if you put in Andersonville and the Library of Congress, prints and photographs collection, an incredible series of photographs taken in August of 1864 at Andersonville, which shows you the type of small tent shelters that people were trying to dig out of the ground. There was a stream that ran through the bottom third of the site that was used as the sinks for the toilets and for water. It was pretty horrific. So a lot of the day, I think, was trying to get through from one day to the next. Was what most of them spent their time as more and more men came in and waiting consistently as rumor after rumor after rumor of an imminent parole came, and trying to survive long enough to see it.
False hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly strikes me that there's, some ugly stuff going on here. Just the sheer poignancy of somebody that had grown up in the famine, had come to maturity. So being self-aware of that. And then from what I understand in Andersonville, like one of the leading causes of death was kind of malnutrition and other diseases related to sanitation. But the horrible irony, if you will, of starving to death in a remote corner of Georgia after surviving the famine just seems particularly brutal. There's no other way to put it.
And it can't have been lost on many of them. Can't have been lost on them. They must have, they must have discussed it.
But there are some other ugly truths. For example, can you talk a little bit about the Andersonville Raiders? Because much as we'd like to kind of, put halos on all these guys, the story of the Anderson Raiders struck me as being a particularly disturbing element of this story. And it wasn't, certainly there was Irish involvement in that. So can you...
They were largely Irish American by all accounts. And there's a new book out, if anyone's interested in it, by Gary Morgan on the Raiders. But the Raiders were a group of men who were, if you like, a group of roughs, which was a common term given to urban working class men who kind of formed themselves into gangs. Urban working class men were usually called roughs by middle and upper class, but they formed a group where they started to go around and extort food and money and possessions off of other prisoners within the prison, and there was significant violence involved. Allegedly, some killings in relation to it. And so they formed a gang, apparently, in one part of the camp. There are always questions with these things in relation to how many of gangs were operating. And again, things come into it that are interesting to consider and unpick in relation to bias against certain ethnic groups. But eventually, the other prisoners in Andersonville had enough, and so they approached the Confederate Commandant Henry Wirtz, and they asked them. They formed their own group, if they could form their own group, to police the camp and to bring these raiders to justice, and that was approved. And a number of them were tried by the prisoners and executed by the prisoners with the permission of the Confederate authorities. And those men who were executed, a handful of them are buried off to one side from the main group. And most of them are Irish American as well. It's worth noting then that the regulators after, who are supposed to then have themselves become pretty bad in relation to how they dealt with other prisoners. But when you extract, and it's an interesting, particularly in the urban working class areas of cities like New York, where a lot of these men came from, it kind of operated in groups like this. A lot of them operated in tight groups, and particularly when you put people under extreme circumstances in somewhere like Andersonville, it's rife for this sort of interaction, I think. And so it's a very interesting element of it.
Yeah, when I was reading about it, I noted the names in the Raiders included a Sarsfield, a Collins, a Delaney, a Sullivan, as being some of the primary ringleaders in this. Just kind of picking up that theme of dark history, and of course we're talking about cemeteries, so cemeteries are fairly dark as it is, but one of the things, Jim, that I noticed in the data that you'd uncovered was the enormous number of children or unbaptized children. And I read somewhere that to some degree might have been this unbaptized designation might have to do with the fact that these were children born into prostitution. They may themselves actually have been aborted. But I wonder if you could cast some more light on that.
Yeah. This is fascinating. So I'm learning a lot. I've always been interested in Andersonville, and this is great stuff to hear. So about 1/10 of the burials are listed in the records as stillborn. And we're still trying to wrap our heads around what that meant in a 19th century context. We do know that in Leadville, there was a large red light district that consisted of as many as 20 or more brothels. And the alley behind those brothels was known as Stillborn Alley. So we've tried to, what we do have are the surnames of the stillborn. So parent's surname, and we've been able to link some of them to those who are listed in the census as prostitutes. So we know that some of them were, pregnancies ended early by prostitutes, but we don't really know how many that is. It's certainly not the majority. So this also gets into the difficult terrain of abortion politics in 19th century context, which is hard to kind of understand. So there are entire sections that are just stillborn, and we think that that's also related to the fact that unbaptized, are buried separately. So I say the cemetery it speaks to us differently every time I'm up there. I learn something new. It's like learning to read a different kind of text, a cemetery. And I'm sure at Andersonville it's the same to read that text. So yeah, so there are difficult pieces of this that are hard to even talk about because we don't really know them very well yet. So. But I think there is one stone, a lot of families have over the years used the records to identify exactly where their loved one's born. And then they've put a modern day stone down. So there's stones scattered about. There's probably 30 or 40. And that's increasing with recognition of the memorial. More and more families are putting stones down. One of those stones is a Flannery family. This is a couple that fled Ireland during the famine, had 13 children. And 5 of them died in a smallpox epidemic in Leadville in 1883. Another died in a scarlet fever epidemic a few years later. So they lost 6 of those 13. The other 7 survived into adulthood and are buried elsewhere. Those are the stories that speak to the hardship of life in this camp at 10,000 feet. By the way, hearing Damian talk about the Andersonville Raiders, and there was a group in Leadville that called themselves the Regulators, and this was a group that decided in the second strike that when the companies recruited American-born miners, scabs from Missouri, to reopen the mines that they reopened were in the Irish community. One was named the Robert Emmet Mine. This was deeply offensive to the Irish. So this group called the Regulators, about 50 guys who were like a splinter group from the Union, they decided to attack these mines in the middle of the night to take them back. And they built a homemade cannon. This thing shot chains. And they perched it on a bluff above the Robert Emmet Mine. And they attacked the mine. But what they didn't realize is that the Union was infiltrated. The company knew the attack was coming. The guards were ready, and it was a bloodbath. The official death toll was 6, but the newspapers reported rumors that over 20 died that night, and they were hastily buried near the railroad tracks. So I think that this kind of survival instinct is deeply rooted in the Irish soul. Knowing what they need to do and whatever means necessary. I'll just add one more piece. The legendary Molly Maguire's struggle in the anthracite region of Pennsylvania. When those hangings happened in the 1870s, it was exactly the same time that Leadville started booming. So many of those miners from Pennsylvania made their way to Leadville. We know this because of birth records and census reports. And a student of mine just made a master list of all the people who were incarcerated in Pennsylvania for Molly Maguire activity and cross-referenced those names with Leadville records and found a couple of dozen people who were clearly involved in that activity in Pennsylvania and made their way to Leadville. The Pinkertons followed them out there, and they were hunted. Many of them changed their names to try to stay anonymous, but many of them were captured. And so that was an ongoing struggle that made its way over from Pennsylvania to Leadville.
That's an interesting, the timeline makes sense. It's just amazing that you see, these people traveling such incredible distances from difficult circumstance to difficult circumstance. And one of the other oddities that I saw between your two projects was an interesting overrepresentation from Ireland's largest county, that being the county of Cork, in both Andersonville, I think, and also in Leadville. Specifically, I believe, Jim, there's one particular town that's heavily represented. Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, and the tip of the Beara Peninsula, there was a copper mining region near a town called Allihies, and the church records in Leadville were very useful because they listed not just the country, but the county of birth. So based upon those records, I discovered that over a third of all the Irish in Leadville, the Irish born in Leadville, came from Cork. And after some scratching around in that history, it was clear that they had come from the copper mining region of Allihies. And so I made my way out there a couple of years ago. I decided to bicycle from Dublin to Allihies, which was a mistake.
Sorry. Just for our American listeners, can you explain what that challenge was, please?
It took me 3 days. They nearly found me as roadkill somewhere in the Beara Peninsula along the rocky shores, but I made it at 10 o'clock at night on the third day. And anyway, what came out of that visit is Allihies and Leadville are now, they've twinned, they're now sister cities. And we're having a ceremony next Sunday when we're up there for the memorial. The only bummer is that our friends from Allihies who were coming for that ceremony can't travel. But we're still having them participate virtually. So that's been a great thing. There's now student exchanges that are starting between the towns. And we've had monthly Zoom meetings over the summer to make that all happen.
Jim, looking ahead to the future a little bit, we've been talking about the memorial at Leadville, and we can show photos on social media and on our website. But describe the kind of the concept that you're looking to produce. What's going to look like? What's it going to feel like?
The memorial is going to be quite large. It's a raised mound about 100 feet in diameter. There's spiral walkways that lead to the center. There will be a statue of a miner kneeling on one knee, that's sort of carving out of a big piece of granite, carving a harp, sort of symbolic. And he's looking upward pensively, sort of reflectively. We didn't want a statue of a miner flexing his muscles, swinging a pickaxe. What we in labor history sometimes refer to as worker porn, right. Which is just a sort of masculine figure of a male worker. We wanted something that reflects someone who might be thinking about life beyond those mines, and then on all four sides of the statue will be glass panels that will have the names of 1,339 individuals in the graves. And then there'll be a series of kiosks that tell the larger story, some benches. We're also trying to just be respectful of the fact this is a small cemetery, and we don't want this to be kind of too overwhelming or take up all the oxygen in the space from the other stories that are revealed by the cemetery. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea of what it'll look like. We're hoping to have an unveiling maybe this time next year, optimistically.
And not a lot of oxygen to go around at 10,000 feet.
That's true. Yeah.
Just boomerang back to you, Damian, and the Cork connection in Andersonville. How represented is that? I do think the numbers are tilted in Cork. Talk a little bit about that.
So the period of famine immigration, Cork had the highest population in the country, and everyone I would imagine is probably familiar, even if they would recognize it if they didn't see it, but some of the real famous images from places like West Cork during the famine. and so it saw mass immigration and mass chain migration. So there's really no doubt that the highest contribution to the Union military during the war on a county basis was out of Cork. So it would be no surprise to see Cork and Munster generally very well represented in terms of the numbers. And it's interesting actually because, they come up as well. Like, I think I've got a minor or two. So you're getting guys from the same sort of regions. There's an awful lot of guys down West Cork. You occasionally identify people. I've plenty of guys from Beara there's a couple of Beara guys actually in Andersonville, definitely. And there are plenty of guys from Beara that I've come across before, the Beara Peninsula. So you get this interesting crossover on that respect of people who, I suppose, who didn't live long enough to go to places like Leadville. But yeah, so you would expect to see that. And one of the things we're trying to do, it's very difficult. One of the outputs is to try and narrow guys down within the counties. Like, so in a Civil War context, you're lucky enough if it says Ireland. People tend not to tell you what county they're from unless it's of relevance to them trying to get the financial aid that they're trying to get or in the military. But we do have some who we can pin down much closer than that. We actually have two guys now in Andersonville where I could go on Google Earth and show you the ruins of the house in Ireland that they were almost certainly born in, because of the level of the records that we can get out of them. So that's one of the things that we're really trying to do. Because, there has been a problem in Ireland. It's an oft-used phrase of kind of leaving the immigrant at the port. People will talk about the famine, and then everybody leaves and goes to America, and then that's the end of the story. But we're very keen to tie people back because people are significantly more interested in history and heritage when they can relate to it on the level that they can go, oh, that person was from my town, my village, my town land, whatever it might be, my county. So you see that kind of level of engagement. So it's really important to try and locate these guys. But we have people from all 32 counties currently.
I'm reminded of when you talk about, how people connect with this history of apparently a misattributed quote to Joseph Stalin. The death of an individual is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. And so what I think you guys are bringing out are those stories that allow people to kind of connect into the past and realize that these are just flesh and blood people with far greater challenges than we face, in the 21st century, but still flesh and blood people. And so when we stop talking about hundreds or thousands and start talking about the individual stories, it gets very real. Just to follow up, Damian, is there any plan to do something specific to memorialize the Irish in Andersonville? I know it is a national cemetery, so I believe people are very cautious about making changes to that.
Yeah. We're currently beginning negotiations. The National Park Service has been incredible in relation to their assistance and their support generally. We are hoping down the line, and we're looking towards that, to have there's a kind of a memorial gardens and things like that there, to have a tree dedicated to the Irish with a plaque under it that marks not only the men buried there, but I think it's really important. It's one that's coming out and it'd be close to my heart, having spent so long with the widows of the American Civil War, but the families, the impact on those people who aren't buried in the National Cemetery, but who are impacted by it on both sides of the Atlantic and in Britain and in Canada, who lost people there. And about the men, I did a lot of research on a guy who came home to Arranmore Island, a small island off the west coast of Donegal, and died there in the 20th century, broken from his experience in Andersonville. So a lot of people who lived through it. So it's to try and capture all of them. So that's one parcel of it. And so there's a kind of the three-pronged thing is the database of identified men. The current one is up online at the moment, the map of Ireland showing connections. And again, the current state of play with 450 men is there. And then hopefully we can have this this kind of modest remembrance of them at Andersonville as well.
You know, Jim, we're getting to the portion of the program we call the shameless plug, a chance for you to put whatever you're doing on the radar of our listeners, plug in any kind. But Jim, I got to sneak one more question in. Have we yet mentioned who visited the Opera House in Leadville about 140 years ago?
Yeah, Oscar Wilde gave a talk on aesthetics and art in a packed opera house, Irish miners mostly. And following his talk, they took him down to into the matchless mine, the bowels of the mine, and had a whiskey drinking contest. And Wilde is said to have outdrank all the miners, but we don't know the real story there.
That has to go in the movie version of all this, Jim.
Yeah.
So let's hear, Jim. What should we know about you, and what is it that you'd like our listeners to respond to?
Well, if anyone wants to donate, we're still not quite made it to our fundraising goal, but we're getting closer. But the Irish Network of Colorado's website, inco.org, I believe, is where you can make a donation. We're having a big, I call it a groundbreaking, even though ground's already been broken, ceremony and celebration up there next Sunday, the 26th at 10 a.m. to noon at the cemetery. We have speakers and music, followed by the city's St. Patrick's Practice Parade, and then a reception to celebrate the twinning of Leadville and Allihies. It's a full day of Irish activity up there. And I guess I'll just close by saying, Irish people in this country with Irish roots today are every data collection shows quite comfortable. And this memorial is really an opportunity to look across about 4 or 5 generations and realize how far we are removed from this larger story that Damian's talking about as well. So I think this memorial is a chance to reflect on what that means, that Irish people in this country have come so far, but have such little knowledge of where they've come from. And that's what we're working on.
And Jim, the website is irishnetworkco.com, irishnetworkco.com. That's where you can donate.
That's it.
And coincidentally, I spoke with Alan Rourke today, who's the head of the Irish Network Colorado. We had a good conversation. Damian, how about you?
Yeah, so if people are interested in contributing, or if anyone decides that they want to go off and research guys who might have perished in Andersonville, we have a project email where you can make submissions to us. So that's andersonvilleirish@gmail.com. And any of if it's a new entry as well, any of the stuff that gets put up on the map is credited to whoever contributes the information. But if people want to check out where we're at currently, we're at over 500 identified men now, but the last map and database update is at the 450 mark. But the database, the whole project as we go the information is being made freely accessible online. So it's current home, and we're hoping to get a more specific home for it, where there can be little biographies of every man that we've identified down the line. But currently, if you go to the Irish American Civil War website, so www.irishamericancivilwar.com, there is an Andersonville Irish Project page there. And if you go onto that page, there's an interactive map of Ireland where you can click in and you can see all these tabs all over the country. And if you click onto them, it'll have information on the individuals located at that area. And then there's the mass database, because obviously there's a lot of men that we only have identified to Ireland, sits below that on the page, and people can explore that, organized with their details of where they were from and who they served with, etc., and where they're buried in the cemetery. So people can check that out.
I just want to amplify Damian's website is an amazing trove of 10 years of work on the Irish in the Civil War, Andersonville being an important part of that, but actually at this point still a small part of it. I'm sure it will grow. I do recommend, people pay that website a visit. And just to amplify a little bit on Damian's work, I believe you're also able to contribute to Damian's Patreon site. Is there a link to that on that website?
You can, yeah. You can, there's PayPal as well. There's lots of ways to try if you want to support the work. And we did briefly. I must give a shout out to Catherine and Brendan, who've recently come on board to help with the site as well. Brendan, who when he started helping was living in Colorado, but has since moved further east. But they're adding greatly to the content that we're putting up there at the moment.
So with that, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for walking us through your respective 19th century cemeteries. There's a lot to be learned here. As I mentioned earlier, I think the past is not so very long ago. None of us are that far removed. I think just a few generations. And I strongly recommend we will put links up to your, various sites, etc., that you pay a visit to those sites and learn a little bit more about the amazing work that's been done by Damian Shiels and Jim Walsh. So thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Well, John, the history nerd in me really enjoyed that conversation, but I can't be truly honest unless I acknowledge the fact that a lot of the stuff that we discussed on this episode is unrelentingly grim. And I don't find these conversations interesting because I got some kind of fetish over pain and misery. I think it's really important to understand where the Irish came from, how difficult their lives were when they came to America. And that stands in stark contrast to the comfortable lives that you and I lead, and pretty much every other Irish American in this country.
Yes, Martin, and I've been to Leadville, 10,000 feet high, not a lot of oxygen to go around. I can't imagine these poor people, hungry, ill-equipped, trying to weather the winter in Leadville, Colorado. With both of these speakers, we heard some little-known history of the Irish in America, the Irish in the West and the Irish in the Civil War. And from a comment Damian made, really the same class of people fighting both of these wars, the Civil War for America and the other war, the war of industrial labor, as Jim described it.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is we actually noticed people from your county of origin in Ireland, in Cork, they're overrepresented in both of these stories. And simply because Cork got hit by the famine much harder than many other places in Ireland. And consequently, by virtue of the fact that it is the largest county in Ireland, the most populous county in Ireland, unsurprisingly, had the most immigrants from Ireland at the time. But the other thing that was interesting to me as a genealogical nerd was the challenges that this presents in terms of simply identifying who is Irish. Damian paints Irish with a particular brush that some people might agree with, some might disagree with. But he refers to the Irish Americans as those Irish that fought in the Civil War that were born in Ireland, or that were ethnically Irish that would have had both parents that were Irish. I think that's not a bad definition, certainly for that time.
I think Jim, had much the same situation at Leadville, because some of these were Irish who had first been in Pennsylvania at coal mines, and then maybe their progeny moved on to Colorado, or they themselves. So are they Americans or are they Irish? Looking to sum up the whole thing, I go back to the kind of paraphrase the quote from Ambassador Dan Mulhall, how the Leadville Memorial is an opportunity to cast our minds back to a darker day for an understanding of the true nature of Irish immigration.
Yeah, I think it's important, and I think Jim was making this point very clearly in the conversation, that this is a recurring story. The Irish were up at the plate and had their swing at the bat. And now there's many other cultures going through the same strains and difficulties, maybe not quite as harsh as what the Irish experienced, but still challenging. And I guess what Jim is basically calling on us is to remind ourselves, there, but for the grace of God, go I.
Things going on in the news here in the United States right now. We're talking as the migrant situation on the southern border, with the influx of Haitian people looking to get in. There couldn't be a hotter topic in the news right now. As we wrap up, I just want to mention two other names. I'd like to thank Michael O'Byrne, who really put this story on the map for me personally a few years ago. And he's a real driving force behind this Leadville Irish Miners Memorial, as is Alan Groark of Irish Network Colorado. I coincidentally spoke with Alan the day we spoke with Jim and Damian, and they're the folks who are really spearheading this impressive memorial. They'll need some more help from all of us to get it done.
And I just conclude by simply thanking both Jim and Damian. I was delighted to put two such knowledgeable guys in the same virtual room together.
Well, Martin, a lot of our listeners ask how they can help spread the global Irish conversation. What do you think?
Best thing people can do to help out the podcast is to simply share the episode. If you like what you've heard so far in this episode or other episodes, share it on social media, whether that's Facebook or whether that's Twitter or whether that's Instagram, or share it via email or word of mouth. All of those things are going to help us out. And don't be shy about dropping us a note. You can do so on our website.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.